Hey guys, here's your test notes on the imperialism test for tomorrow. We're focusing, remember, on Africa and Japan because their experiences with imperialism were very different. I'm going to try to go fast. That way, if you only have one chance to listen to this, you hear all the information. And if you have the kind of time to listen to it again, then you can go back. All right. One of the things I'm going to ask you about is explain the connection between industrialization and imperialism. Industry needs raw materials. If you are successful with industry, you're making stuff. But to make stuff, you need stuff, all right? So raw materials can be provided by colonies. It was one of the very basic underlying reasons of why countries wanted to go and colonize other lands, to get stuff, resources. All right, then I'm going to ask you to tell me 4 reasons motivating European imperialism. The 4 main reasons I'm looking for: money and trade, okay, economic reasons. 2, raw materials and resources for industry. 3, missions and the hope to end the slave trade. Remember, missionaries were in favor of imperialism because they thought they could do some good there. And number 4 is nationalism. I know we have been over what nationalism is, but here what I want you to know is it's one of the main reasons for imperialism. If you think your country's great, you want to get out there, spread it around. If your country needs to be great, you need to acquire colonies and add to your power. All right, then I'm going to ask you, explain the idea of social Darwinism. Remember, Charles Darwin, from a scientific point of view, talked about survival of the fittest in different species. People took that idea and applied it to society, specifically racism. All right, they said, well, if my race is doing well, that's proof that we're the fittest, and therefore we have the right to dominate other races. One of those taking science and twisting it to meet your needs. But social Darwinism is basically racism based on the idea of survival of the fittest. All right, up until the 19th century, what had kept Europeans from successfully colonizing Africa? Remember our video when we watched John Green and he said, in the past, it wasn't that people didn't want to colonize Africa, it's that they couldn't. And the stuff standing in their way specifically was disease. Remember, they had malaria transmitted by mosquitoes that would make people ill, make people die. They couldn't do much. Then there was another disease that killed their horses. So before they had any medication for that, that was a big deterrent. Then there's the lack of technology. Before you had your railroad, telegraph, steamboat, machine gun, all that stuff, you weren't able to get much further in than the coast. So it made it hard to colonize. And then lastly, the African people fought back. This was a big issue before the Maxim gun because they were great warriors. It was the same kind of technology against the same kind of technology. So that all changed once the Europeans had the Maxim gun. But before then, they couldn't handle the fact that the Africans fought back. Okay, how did the slave trade contribute to African disunity and ultimately help European colonies? Think back to when we studied the slave trade. It wasn't white men going into Africa, hunting them down and dragging them off. Africans hunted down other Africans and then traded for them. It was a financial deal. The way this created a problem for Africa during the age of imperialism is it created disunity among the tribes. In other words, if you're going to steal somebody from my tribe and sell them into slavery, we're not getting along. And if they're not getting along, then they can't work together to fight against the Europeans. All right, what's imperialism? Let's get to the heart of the matter. Remember, it's when a stronger country dominates a weaker country, or at least part of its territory. All right, what was Africa like before European domination of the continent? Remember, we talked about there was a lot of cultural diversity, many, many tribes. Remember that map we looked at with all the red lines that showed how many tribes and different languages? And over 1,000 different languages were spoken. Before 1880, the parts of Africa under European control were mainly where? Okay, this is getting at what I mentioned before. I'm looking for along the coast, right? Before the technology to get further inland, if there was a colony, it was along the coast. Then what invention made travel possible on African rivers? Steamboat. What was the name of the drug that helped fight malaria? Quinine. It's the only one that's a medicine I'll ask you about. And remember, it didn't cure malaria, but it did treat the effects, and it made it possible for people to colonize without dying from it. Who were the first Europeans in Africa? The missionaries, humanitarians, and explorers. All right, people just looking to either spread religion or they're just out to explore the continent, usually with a very small band of people. It wasn't large groups of conquerors. All right, who was hired to find the missing missionary, Dr. Livingstone? Remember, this is Henry Stanley. He is the U.S. reporter and explorer that ends up finding him, and it becomes an international story. And he has the famous line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, when he finds him. And because of this story being such a success, it got the notice of European nations, specifically Belgium. King Leopold II of Belgium took over a large area in Africa called the Congo. And then when he took over the control there, it became the Belgian Congo. So, again, King of Belgium, King Leopold II. Remember, he's the one that got in there and set up the rubber trade and was very cruel to the people. All right, name of the first automatic machine gun. I already told you earlier, Maxim gun. I think we all know that by now. Meeting of European nations to divide claims in Africa. That was the Berlin Conference. And you just remember, that's that meeting of European nations. No Africans were there. Took place in Berlin, which is Germany. And they sliced up that map. All right, the only two countries still under African rule after that happened were Ethiopia and Liberia. And then the war in South Africa between the Dutch and the British, that was the Boer War. Remember, Boer is the name for Dutch farmers. So this war breaks out between the Dutch and the British. Yes, Africans were involved, specifically the Zulu tribes, but they were only involved because it happened on their land. The actual problem was between the Dutch and the British. So that's the Boer War. All right, before the 19th century, Japan kept to itself as a nation. What is that practice called? When one nation keeps to itself? That is isolationism. All right, and obviously, with no good transition here, we're moving into Japan. All right, so Japan gets in on the game when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry shows up in Tokyo Harbor, remember, with the steamships and the cannon, and he presents that letter from President Fillmore that basically says, we're going to be back in a year. We're going to bring more ships next time, and we really hope you'll open up trade with us. So Matthew Perry is the name of the Commodore who did that. And that's what set off the Japanese need to modernize and westernize. They realized that they needed to get with the game in order to compete and protect themselves. All right, so the Japanese emperor who modernized and westernized Japan, that's Emperor Meiji. Remember, Mutsuhito was his name, and then they called it the Meiji era. He took on that name because it meant enlightened. All right, so what exactly did Meiji do? What are the steps he took to modernize and westernize? He took a look at the government, the military, the education system, and he wanted all those things to be more Western. Specifically, he adopted the government style from Germany and also their army. He admired the Navy of Great Britain, the British Navy, and then it was the U.S. public educational system that he copied as well. He liked the idea that all the children in the country would be educated. Meiji also supported the path to Western industrialization. In other words, he saw, hey, they're building railroads, they're building ships, they're building industry, and he modeled that and took the same path. Why did Japan go to war with China? Remember, this is that struggle over Korea. They had signed an agreement that they would both stay out of Korea. China sent their army into Korea. Japan didn't like it. They went to war. Who won? Japan, surprisingly. But that's all thanks to their modernization. And then what country went to war with Japan next? That was Russia. Once Japan emerged from that war with China, once they emerged the victor, then Russia was interested in establishing their power in Asia. They also went to war with Japan. Russo-Japanese War. Who won that one? Japan again. And this one's the big, huge, significant win because it was the first time a race that was considered inferior by European standards had proved themselves just as adequate as a white race. It also created that problem of the new stereotype of the yellow peril, which they used to think, okay, we're superior, they can't beat us, then they proved that they could beat them, so it became a new form of racism where people were afraid that Asian races would band together and take over Europeans. All right, here's the map stuff you should study. I didn't write the list on here, but here, we can do it by memory. Okay, so you need to know Pacific Ocean, United States, Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean. Here's India. It does kind of look like that on a real map. Remember, there's the little Sri Lanka is right here, and it looks like a teardrop to me. So I can always remember that that's India. So if you're by India, you're also by the Indian Ocean. All right, Europe. You can find it on the map. Looks tiny, but you can find it if you can find the boot for Italy here. And then the island nation off of Europe that looks like it's almost touching the continent on your map, that's Great Britain. All right, then we have Africa. I'm going to ask you about the continent as a whole. Where is it? And then Liberia and Ethiopia. Okay, up here in this area, Russia, then China. This little guy hanging off the side of China, or so it looks, is Korea. And then Japan forms this sort of little crescent-shaped island here. I think that's all I ask you on the map. But you have your map, so you can study it and check me out on that. If you have any questions, just post on Edmodo. I'll check it at some point tonight. But remember, you're going to have to do short answer. You're going to have to fill in the blank. And you're going to have to do matching on the map. This is not your regular multiple choice test. So do your best and listen to this again if you must. Bye-bye.